Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that tested every decision Margaret had made. By November, snow was falling regularly, and the creek beside her cabin sang a different song as ice formed along its banks. But Margaret had spent the autumn months working with desperate determination, and the little cabin had been transformed into something resembling a proper home. Thomas Fletcher had proven to be an invaluable ally. True to his word about helping neighbors, he had returned twice during the fall to assist with major repairs. Together, they had chinked the cabin walls, replaced the leaking roof sections, and installed 2 precious glass windows that Thomas had hauled up from Bozeman. More importantly, he had taught Margaret the crucial skills of frontier survival: how to split firewood efficiently, how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, and how to maintain her equipment. Independence is admirable, he had said during his last visit in October, but stubbornness can kill you. Don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it. Now, as December wind howled around the cabin walls, Margaret was grateful for every piece of advice he had given her. The cabin was snug and warm, with a stone fireplace that drew properly and enough firewood stacked outside to last until spring. Her larder was stocked with preserves, dried meat, beans, and flour. She had even managed to acquire 2 chickens from a traveling farmer, and their eggs supplemented her diet nicely. The mining claim itself had yielded modest results. Working carefully with the equipment Harold had left behind, Margaret had extracted nearly $200 worth of silver ore during the fall months. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to pay for her supplies and give her hope that the claim might support her long term. More surprising than her success with mining was how much she enjoyed the physical work. After months of feeling powerless and ashamed, there was deep satisfaction in swinging a pickaxe, in feeling her muscles grow stronger, in looking at a pile of ore-bearing rock and knowing she had earned every nugget through her own efforts. The mountains didn't care about her past or her reputation. They responded only to hard work and practical knowledge. The isolation that might have driven another person to madness became Margaret's greatest comfort. For the first time since childhood, she could speak aloud without worrying about judgment. She talked to her chickens, sang while she worked, and read aloud from the few books she possessed during the long winter evenings. The silence of the mountains was profound, but it was a peaceful silence rather than the oppressive quiet of social ostracism. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Margaret had no gifts to exchange or family dinner to attend, but she cooked herself a special meal and allowed herself an extra cup of coffee while watching snow fall outside her windows. It was a solitary celebration, but not a lonely one. She felt more genuinely content than she had in years. January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days and tested all her preparations. Margaret huddled in the cabin, feeding the fire regularly and listening to the wind scream across the valley. On the second day, when her firewood supply inside ran low, she had to venture out in the storm to bring in more logs. The cold was so intense it made her lungs ache, and the snow was deep enough to reach her thighs. But she managed the task and returned to her warm cabin with a profound sense of accomplishment. "I survived that," she said aloud to the crackling fire. "I actually survived that." February brought a different kind of challenge. Margaret woke one morning to find one of her chickens dead and the other acting strangely. She had no experience with poultry diseases, and the loss of her egg supply would be a serious blow to her nutrition. After examining the surviving bird carefully, she made the difficult decision to butcher it rather than risk losing it to whatever had killed the first. The task was unpleasant but necessary, and Margaret approached it with the same practical determination she applied to everything else. By evening, she had fresh meat cooking over her fire and feathers cleaned for pillow stuffing. It wasn't the outcome she had hoped for, but she had adapted to the situation without panic or despair. Spring arrived gradually, marked first by longer days and, then, by the sound of melting snow running in rivulets toward the creek. Margaret emerged from her winter hibernation like a bear awakening from a long sleep. She had made it through the hardest season, and the accomplishment filled her with quiet pride. As the weather warmed, she resumed work on the mining claim. The winter had given her time to study Harold's old maps and notes, and she had formed theories about where the most promising ore might be located. Her months of physical labor had made her stronger, and she attacked the work with renewed energy. In early May, as she was working a new section of creek bank, Margaret heard the distant sound of horses approaching. Visitors were so rare that she stopped work immediately and climbed up from the creek bed to see who was coming. Two riders were making their way up the valley, and, as they drew closer, she recognized one of them as Thomas Fletcher. Her heart began beating faster, though she couldn't say whether from excitement or anxiety. Over the winter months, she had often thought about Thomas and his quiet kindness. His visits had become bright spots in her memory, and she had sometimes caught herself listening for the sound of approaching horses. The second rider turned out to be a woman, which surprised Margaret considerably. As they drew nearer, she could see that Thomas's companion was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair and a practical way of sitting her horse that spoke of long experience in the saddle. "Margaret," Thomas called out as they approached the cabin. "Good to see you made it through the winter in one piece." "More than one piece," Margaret replied with a smile, wiping her hands on her work apron. "I feel like I'm in better shape than when you left me here." Thomas swung down from his horse and looked around the homestead with approval. "The place looks good. You've been busy." The woman dismounted as well, and Thomas made introductions. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet my sister Sarah. Sarah, this is Margaret Wickham, the woman I told you about." Sarah Fletcher was a handsome woman with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. "Thomas has been singing your praises all winter," she said with a warm smile. "He's very impressed with what you've accomplished here." Margaret felt herself blushing and wasn't sure why. "I've had a lot to learn. Your brother was a good teacher. Among other things, he taught me not to doubt a woman's capabilities," Sarah said with a meaningful look at her brother. "I'm glad to finally meet the person who's been occupying so much of his thoughts." Now both Margaret and Thomas were blushing, and Sarah seemed to enjoy their discomfort. "I've brought supplies from town," she continued smoothly, "and some news that might interest you." Over coffee in Margaret's snug cabin, Sarah shared the latest developments from the outside world. The railroad survey had been completed, and the proposed route would pass within 5 miles of Margaret's claim. Property values in the area were already beginning to rise as speculators bought up land. More immediately relevant, several mining claims downstream had begun producing significant silver yields, confirming the value of the local ore deposits. "There's been talk in town about your situation," Sarah said carefully. "Some folks are impressed that you've made a go of it up here alone. Others think it's improper for an unmarried woman to be living independently." Margaret felt her old anxieties stirring. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing harmful," Thomas said quickly. "But Sarah's right that people have opinions. The territory is changing fast, and not everyone is comfortable with women who don't fit traditional roles." Sarah leaned forward. "That's actually why I wanted to meet you. There are other women like us, Margaret. Women who've had to make their own way in the world. We look out for each other, share information, and provide support when the menfolk get too critical." The idea that she might not be as alone as she thought was both thrilling and intimidating to Margaret. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's strength in numbers," Sarah replied. "And there are advantages to being known as part of a community rather than an isolated oddity. People are more likely to respect what they understand." Thomas had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "What Sarah isn't telling you is that she's organized what amounts to an informal network of independent women throughout this part of the territory. Widows, spinsters, and a few wives whose husbands have more sense than most." Margaret looked between the siblings, trying to process this information. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah smiled. "Because my brother has been worried sick about you all winter, and because I think you're exactly the kind of woman who could benefit from knowing she has allies. Also," Thomas added with apparent reluctance, "because I hoped you might consider attending the spring social in Bozeman next month. As my guest." The invitation hung in the air between them. Margaret realized that Thomas was asking her to step back into society, but this time as a woman with her own property and her own accomplishments rather than as Harold Wickham's discarded wife. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said honestly. "You don't have to decide right now," Sarah said gently. "But think about it. You've proven you can survive on your own. Maybe now it's time to prove you can thrive as part of a community." After Thomas and Sarah left, promising to return in a few weeks, Margaret found herself thinking constantly about their offer. The solitude that had been healing during her first months at the claim was beginning to feel limiting. She had regained her strength and self-respect, but she was also a social creature who missed intelligent conversation and human connection. The mining work continued to go well. By late May, Margaret had extracted enough silver to more than cover her expenses for the year and still have money left over. The claim was proving to be more valuable than anyone had expected, and her careful management was maximizing its yield. But more important than the financial success was what the work had done for her sense of self. Every day brought small victories that built her confidence. She had learned to repair equipment, to read the rock formations that indicated promising deposits, and to plan her work efficiently. She was no longer the desperate woman who had fled Cedar Ridge in shame. She was Margaret Wickham, property owner and successful prospector. When Thomas returned alone in early June, Margaret had made her decision. "I'll come to the social," she told him as they sat by the creek in the evening light. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not looking for rescue or protection. If people are going to accept me, they need to accept who I've become, not who they think I should be." Thomas smiled, and Margaret realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face. "I wouldn't want you any other way," he said. "Good. Because I like who I'd become up here. I like being strong and independent and capable. I won't give that up to make other people comfortable." "The right people won't ask you to," Thomas replied. "And anyone who does ask isn't worth your time." As they talked into the night, Margaret realized that her winter of solitude had prepared her for more than just mining and cabin maintenance. It had taught her to value herself not based on other people's opinions, but on her own achievements and character. The shame that had driven her from Cedar Ridge was gone, replaced by quiet pride in what she had accomplished. The social in Bozeman would be a test of sorts, a chance to see whether the world was ready for the person she had become. But, regardless of the outcome, Margaret knew she would return to her mountain claim as a woman who belonged to herself completely. That knowledge was worth more than all the silver in the creek, and no one could ever take it away from her. The mountains had given her back to herself, and that was the greatest fortune she could have asked for. Whatever came next, she would face it as Margaret Wickham, prospector and property owner, a woman who had found her strength in the wilderness and would carry it with her wherever life led her next. Standing by her cabin in the gathering dusk, listening to the eternal song of Silver Creek, Margaret smiled at the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. She had everything she needed: a home she had made with her own hands, work that challenged and rewarded her, and the quiet confidence that came from having tested herself against the hardest conditions and emerged victorious. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and perhaps new relationships built on respect rather than need. But tonight, Margaret was content to be exactly who she was, exactly where she was, with the vast Montana sky stretched out above her like a promise of infinite possibilities. The wagon rolled steadily through the mountain passes, its wheels finding familiar ruts in the dirt road that connected Cedar Ridge to the wider world. Margaret sat beside Thomas Fletcher, grateful for the man's quiet nature. He wasn't one for unnecessary conversation, but when he did speak, his words carried the weight of someone who chose them carefully. On the second day of travel, as they made camp beside a clear mountain stream, Thomas finally asked about her circumstances. They had just finished a simple meal of beans and hardtack when he looked across the flickering campfire with those serious brown eyes. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you're settling your husband's estate," he said, feeding another stick to the flames. "That's a difficult thing for a woman to handle alone." Margaret studied his weathered face, looking for signs of judgment or prying curiosity. She found neither. "My husband wasn't much of a provider," she said carefully. "I don't expect his estate will amount to much." Thomas nodded and stirred the fire with a long stick. "Mining claims can be tricky. Lot of folks come west thinking they'll strike it rich, but the mountains don't give up their treasures easily." "You know about mining?" Margaret asked. "Some. I tried my hand at it before I took up ranching. Spent 2 years chasing silver veins that led nowhere. The only ones who really got rich were the men selling supplies to hopeful miners. He looked up at the star-filled sky. That's when I learned there's more security in raising cattle than digging holes in the ground. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. If Harold's claim was as worthless as Thomas suggested, she would be back where she started, but with even fewer options. How can you tell if a claim has value? Location matters most. Some areas have proven deposits, others are just wishful thinking. The lawyer should have records showing how much came out of the claim, if any. Thomas met her eyes across the fire. What will you do if it turns out to be worthless? It was a fair question, and one that had been keeping her awake at night. I honestly don't know, she admitted. I can't go back to Cedar Ridge. There's nothing for me there. What about family back east? Margaret's laugh was bitter. They made it clear that a divorced woman would bring shame to their doorstep. A widow might be more acceptable, but I don't think they'd welcome me with open arms. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire. For what it's worth, he said finally, leaving a man who hurt you took courage. Most folks just see the scandal, but some of us recognize strength when we see it. The unexpected kindness in his words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. For months, she had been drowning in shame and self-doubt, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by leaving Harold. To hear someone acknowledge her choice as brave rather than shameful was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting her voice to carry more words. They settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying fire, but Margaret lay awake for hours, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. Thomas Fletcher's simple words of support had done something to ease the burden of guilt she had been carrying. Maybe her choices hadn't been perfect, but they had been hers to make. The third day brought them down into the valley where Bozeman sprawled along the Gallatin River. It was larger than Cedar Ridge, with real brick buildings and wooden sidewalks. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as new construction reached toward the sky. This was a town with ambition, a place where people came to build futures rather than simply survive. Thomas guided the wagon to a respectable hotel and helped Margaret down from the seat. The lawyer's office should be on Main Street, he said, consulting a piece of paper. Morrison and Associates. Would you like me to come with you? Margaret was tempted to accept his offer, but she knew this was something she needed to face alone. Thank you, but I need to do this myself. He nodded with understanding. I'll be loading supplies most of the day. Meet back here before sunset? The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied the second floor of a solid brick building. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs with her heart pounding, clutching the letter that had brought her here. The receptionist, a young man with ink-stained fingers, directed her to Mr. Morrison's office. Samuel Morrison was a thin, precise man with spectacles perched on his nose. He gestured for Margaret to take a seat across from his oak desk, which was covered with neat stacks of papers. Mrs. Wickham, he said, consulting a file. I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband's death was quite sudden, I understand. Yes, Margaret replied, not elaborating on her feelings about Harold's demise. Morrison opened the file and spread several documents across his desk. Let me explain the situation. Your late husband owned a mining claim about 30 miles north of here, along Silver Creek. He also owned a small cabin on the property. However, he also accumulated substantial debts. Margaret's heart sank. How substantial? Nearly $800. He owed money to suppliers, the bank, and several individuals in Bannack who advanced him funds for equipment. Morrison looked at her over his spectacles. The good news is that under territorial law, you're not personally responsible for debts incurred before your marriage. What about the mining claim? Morrison pulled out a surveyor's map marked with red ink. The claim itself covers 20 acres along a known silver-bearing creek. Your husband removed approximately $50 worth of ore over the past year, but he spent far more than that on equipment and supplies. Margaret studied the map, trying to make sense of the squiggly lines and elevation markers. Is there more silver in the ground? That's difficult to say. Mining is always a gamble. However, there's something else you should consider. Morrison leaned forward. The railroad is planning to extend a branch line through this area within the next 5 years. If that happens, the land value could increase significantly, even without mineral deposits. This was the first encouraging news Margaret had heard. What are my options? You could attempt to work the claim yourself, though that would be highly unusual for a woman alone. You could sell it, though given the debts, you might only break even. Or you could hold on to it and wait to see what happens with the railroad. Margaret thought about her few remaining coins and her uncertain future. If I kept the claim, where would I live? You mentioned a cabin? Morrison nodded. It's quite rustic, I'm afraid. One room, stone fireplace, no glass windows. Your husband used it during his mining operations. It would require significant work to make it properly habitable. Could I see it before making a decision? Certainly. I could arrange for someone to escort you tomorrow if you'd like. Margaret agreed, though she had no idea how she would pay for another night's lodging. As if reading her mind, Morrison cleared his throat delicately. The estate does have $47 in cash, after settling the most pressing debts. That money belongs to you. $47 was more than Margaret had seen at one time in months. It wasn't enough to live on indefinitely, but it gave her breathing room to make decisions. She accepted the money gratefully and arranged to meet Morrison's guide the next morning. When she returned to the hotel, Thomas was loading the last of his supplies into the wagon. He looked up as she approached, his expression questioning but not prying. The claim exists, she said. But it comes with complications. Over supper in the hotel dining room, she explained what she had learned. Thomas listened carefully, asking occasional practical questions about water rights and property boundaries. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, considering. $47 won't last long, he said finally. But, if you're careful, it might be enough to get through the winter if you have shelter. You think I should keep the claim? Thomas met her eyes. I think you should see it first. Land can fool you. What looks worthless on paper might have potential you can't imagine yet. The next morning, Margaret rode out to the mining claim with Jake Morrison, the lawyer's nephew and a part-time guide. The 30-mile journey took them through some of the most beautiful country Margaret had ever seen. Silver Creek wound through a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, with meadows that still showed touches of late summer green. The cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the creek, positioned to catch the morning sun. It was indeed rustic, with chinking missing between the logs and a roof that clearly leaked in places. But it had good bones and a magnificent view. The mining operation consisted of several holes dug along the creek bank and a small sluice box for washing ore. Your husband worked this stretch here, Jake said, pointing to where the creek curved around a bend. Found enough silver to keep him hopeful, but not enough to make him rich. Margaret walked down to the creek, listening to the water bubble over smooth stones. The air was clean and sharp, scented with pine and the promise of autumn. For the first time in months, she felt a strange sense of peace. This place had none of the judgment and whispers that had made Cedar Ridge unbearable. Is there anyone else living nearby? She asked. Couple of homesteaders about 10 miles upstream. The Fletcher Ranch is about 20 miles south, but that's the closest neighbor in that direction. Jake squinted at her. You're not seriously thinking of staying here alone, are you? Margaret was surprised to realize that she was indeed thinking exactly that. What would I need to make the cabin livable through winter? Jake looked skeptical but answered seriously. New chinking, roof repair, proper windows, a better stove. Food supplies, of course, and enough firewood to last until spring. It wouldn't be easy, especially for someone without experience. But it's possible? Possible, yes. Advisable? He shrugged. That's not for me to say. On the ride back to Bozeman, Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. The claim might not make her rich, but it offered something perhaps more valuable, independence. She could build a life here without the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. It would be hard work, but she was no stranger to hard work. That evening, she found Thomas Fletcher in the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey and reading a newspaper. He looked up as she approached, setting the paper aside. "How did it go?" he asked. Margaret sat down across from him, still wearing her riding clothes and probably smelling of horse and dust. "I want to keep it," she said. "The claim, the cabin, all of it." Thomas studied her face carefully. "It's a big decision. Winter comes early in the mountains, and it's harsh. I know. But it's mine, Thomas. For the first time in my life, I would have something that truly belongs to me." She leaned forward. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about recognizing strength. I want to find out how strong I really am." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then signaled the bartender for another whiskey. When it arrived, he pushed it across the table to Margaret. "Then, I'd say you've got some planning to do." They talked late into the evening about supplies, timelines, and practical considerations. Thomas had opinions on everything from window glass to winter provisions, and Margaret began to realize how much she didn't know about frontier living. But, instead of discouraging her, the magnitude of the challenge seemed to sharpen her resolve. "I'll need to learn quickly," she said. "Learning's one thing," Thomas replied. "Surviving your mistakes is another. The mountains don't forgive ignorance." Margaret met his concerned gaze steadily. "Then, I'll have to make sure I don't make fatal mistakes." Something in her voice must have convinced him that her mind was made up. Thomas nodded slowly and raised his glass. "To new beginnings, then, dot." Margaret lifted her own glass, feeling the burn of whiskey and determination in equal measure. To new beginnings. Tomorrow she would return to the lawyer's office and sign the papers that would make her a property owner. The day after that, she would begin the most challenging chapter of her life. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Cedar Ridge, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The future stretched ahead of her like the mountain valley, full of unknown dangers and unexpected beauty. Margaret Wickham was about to discover what she was truly made of. Margaret stood at the window of her small boarding house room, watching the dust swirl across Main Street in the late afternoon heat. The town of Cedar Ridge, Montana stretched out before her like a promise that had turned sour. 6 months ago, she had arrived here as a mail-order bride, full of hope and nervous excitement. Now she felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a life that had never truly belonged to her. The marriage to Harold Wickham had lasted exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of discovering that the kind, successful businessman she had corresponded with for months existed only in carefully crafted letters. The real Harold was a cruel man with wandering hands and a violent temper who drank away his modest earnings and expected his wife to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw her way. Margaret touched the faded bruise on her wrist, a reminder of their final argument. She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few coins she had managed to save from her household allowance. The scandal had spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. A woman who left her husband, no matter the reason, was marked as damaged goods in the eyes of most folks. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, had been kind enough to let Margaret work for room and board. She cleaned rooms, helped in the kitchen, and mended linens until her fingers were raw. The work was honest, but it barely kept her fed. More painful than the physical hardship was the weight of judgment that followed her everywhere she went. At the general store, conversation stopped when she walked in. Women pulled their children closer and whispered behind their hands. Men either ignored her completely or looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl. She had become the fallen woman of Cedar Ridge, a cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters about the dangers of straying from the proper path. The worst part was Sunday mornings. Margaret still attended church, partly from habit and partly from a stubborn refusal to let shame drive her completely away from God. But sitting alone in the back pew while families filled the rows in front of her was a special kind of torture. Reverend Morrison's sermons seemed to find new ways each week to condemn women who failed in their wifely duties. A woman's place is in submission to her husband, he had thundered just last Sunday, his eyes seeming to find Margaret in the congregation. Those who rebel against this sacred order bring shame not only upon themselves but upon our entire community. Margaret had gripped her worn Bible tighter and tried to remember the verses about God's love and forgiveness. But it was hard to feel worthy of divine mercy when earthly mercy seemed so scarce. The only person who treated her with genuine kindness was Dr. Samuel Harrison, the town's physician. When she had first come to him with injuries from Harold's final rage, he had asked no questions beyond what was necessary for treatment. He simply cleaned her cuts, bound her bruises, and spoke to her with the same gentle respect he showed all his patients. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Wickham," he had said, using her married name without judgment. "And, remember, healing takes time for both body and spirit." Dr. Harrison was a widower in his 50s, having lost his wife to consumption 2 years prior. He lived alone above his practice, and Margaret sometimes caught glimpses of him reading by lamplight when she walked past in the evenings. There was a sadness in his eyes that seemed to recognize something in her own pain. But even his kindness couldn't erase the daily humiliations. Yesterday, she had been let go from helping Mrs. Fletcher with her laundry because the woman's husband decided it wasn't proper to have a woman of questionable morals handling his family's clothing. The loss of those few extra cents each week meant Margaret would have to skip meals more often. As autumn approached, she knew she couldn't survive another winter in Cedar Ridge. The cold mountain air would be merciless, and work would become even scarcer. She had written to her sister back in Ohio, swallowing her pride to ask for help, but the response had been swift and painful. Her family wanted nothing to do with their disgraced daughter. They had invested their reputation in her marriage, and her failure reflected poorly on all of them. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned away from the window. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it was clean and private. Mrs. Patterson had lost her own husband years ago and understood something about the precarious position of women without male protection. She never asked prying questions or made Margaret feel like a charity case. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway with an envelope in her hand, her expression unreadable. "This came for you today," she said, holding out the letter. "Postmark says it's from the territorial capital." Margaret's heart skipped. She wasn't expecting any correspondence, and the formal script on the envelope made her nervous. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter and read its contents twice before the meaning sank in. It was from a lawyer's office, informing her that Harold Wickham had been killed in a gambling dispute 2 towns over. As his legal widow, she was entitled to his property and debts. The lawyer requested her presence to settle the estate. Mrs. Patterson studied Margaret's face with concern. "Bad news, dear?" "My husband is dead," Margaret said quietly, surprising herself with how little emotion colored her words. She felt neither grief nor relief, just a strange emptiness. "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson said, reaching out to touch Margaret's arm. "I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret almost laughed at the conventional expression of sympathy. Loss implied she had possessed something valuable that was now gone. Harold had been many things, but never truly hers in any meaningful way. "What did he leave?" Mrs. Patterson asked practically. "A mining claim and some debts, according to this," Margaret said, holding up the letter. "I'll need to travel to Bozeman to meet with the lawyer." The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "That's a long journey for a woman alone. Do you have money for the stage fare?" Margaret's heart sank. The trip would cost more than she had saved, and she couldn't afford to miss work. But she also couldn't afford to ignore what might be her only chance at financial independence. Harold's mining claim might be worthless, but it was still property. Even if she sold it for a fraction of its value, it could give her enough money to start fresh somewhere else. "I'll manage somehow," she said, though she had no idea how. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "There might be another way. Thomas Fletcher is taking a wagon to Bozeman next week to pick up supplies. He might let you ride along if you help with the driving and don't mind camping rough." Margaret knew Thomas Fletcher slightly. He was a bachelor rancher who kept to himself and treated her with polite indifference rather than open hostility. The idea of traveling with him made her nervous, but it was likely her only option. "Do you think he would agree?" she asked. "Won't know unless we ask, Mrs. Patterson said. His ranch is about 3 miles out of town. I could send word if you'd like. Margaret nodded gratefully. It was a risk, but staying in Cedar Ridge was a slow death by 1,000 small cruelties. At least Harold's death offered the possibility of change, even if she didn't know what that change would bring. That evening, she walked to the edge of town where the road stretched toward the mountains. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there was a future she couldn't yet imagine, but, for the first time in months, she felt a tiny spark of hope. The next morning brought a reply from Thomas Fletcher. He would take her to Bozeman in exchange for cooking duties on the trail and help with the wagon. They would leave in 3 days, giving her time to prepare for what might be the most important journey of her life. Margaret spent those 3 days in careful preparation. She mended her best dress and cleaned her worn boots. Mrs. Patterson gave her a small traveling bag and packed what little food they could spare. Dr. Harrison, learning of her plans when she stopped to thank him for his kindness, pressed a small bottle of laudanum into her hands. For emergencies, he said quietly. The trail can be dangerous, and you never know what you might encounter. On her last evening in Cedar Ridge, Margaret walked through the town one final time. The stores were closing, families were heading home for supper, and the usual rhythm of small-town life continued unchanged. She realized that despite all the pain she had experienced here, this place had also shown her something important about her own strength. She had survived Harold's cruelty, the town's judgment, and months of near poverty. Whatever awaited her in Bozeman and beyond, she was no longer the naive young woman who had stepped off the stage 6 months ago. Thomas Fletcher arrived at dawn with a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and weathered by outdoor work, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands. He helped Margaret load her few possessions without comment or curiosity about her circumstances. The trip will take us 4 days, he said as they climbed onto the wagon seat. We'll camp along the way. I hope you're prepared for rough conditions. I've grown accustomed to making do with very little, Margaret replied, and she meant it. As the wagon rolled out of Cedar Ridge, Margaret didn't look back. The town had been both her prison and her teacher, but that chapter of her life was closing. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. For the first time since her marriage, she felt like the author of her own story rather than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the mountains seemed to call her toward whatever destiny awaited beyond their peaks. Thomas Fletcher drove with quiet competence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or interesting wildlife, but respecting her need for silence as she processed this major transition in her life. Margaret pulled her shawl around her shoulders and settled in for the journey. She was leaving Cedar Ridge as a widow with an uncertain inheritance and an even more uncertain future. But she was also leaving as a woman who had learned that she could endure far more than she had ever imagined, and that knowledge would serve her well in whatever trials lay ahead.